And then, how are you? How are you arriving today?
I yeah, I'm feeling well, feeling grounded. My nervous system's quite relaxed. I hear my daughter out there. She's talking to my wife. She's saying, "Mom, come on, let's go." She wants to go to school soon, so there's that kind of in the background. And I'm also kind of like, I guess, uh, prodded by your check-in question and wondering like about my question. I guess the question that I'd share that has been like guiding me in all of the topic that we're going to talk about really is I guess it's a question around how uh, groups of humans can act together as an intelligent kind of living organism with emergent kind of collective intelligence being generated. Um, that yeah, I'm very interested in that, and I'd say like the path has taken me to that currently that's kind of the specific perspective that I've got, but it didn't start there. Um, yeah.
Hmm. Okay. So could you tell us?
Do you want to check in at all?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't check in because I have all these questions and I couldn't just pick one. But what's coming up right now as the an urgent question is the question of patience. Um, yeah, I notice how dialogue invites me to slow down, and sometimes I just want to move. I don't want to slow down. I usually like to slow down, but I'm curious about that, the pace of dialogue and the pace of capitalism and the pace of life, um, and attuning to each person's pace also. Yeah, this is the question I'm curious about. How does it work? And in tech, I assume there's a rapid pace of um, yeah, getting things done and competition and moving faster than someone else or um, yeah. So that's my check-in. Um, thank you. That helped me to actually settle. Um, so could you tell us a little bit about your background, just how you chose to work in tech in the first place? How was that choice for you?
So I think when I was about, I mean, I've always been very fluent or proficient with computers, but when I was about, can't remember, I would have been maybe early 20s or like late teens. And I was always a little bit of a rebel and saw a lot of uh, just, I was quite anti authority, I guess, and saw a lot of issues with the way the world works. And I read a book about dialogue by a writer called Tom Atlee, who's based in Oregon. It's called The Tao of Democracy. And it really, like, it changed my life and it really blew my mind. And when I read it, I thought, wow, that actually really makes sense as a way to kind of organize and do things. And although I went in to study like computer science and I did commerce as well, at the same time I was like kind of exploring working in the field of dialogue, and during my 20s, I did a course on like a certificate of dialogue and deliberation and kind of pursuing that. And I got a little bit involved in the community, and I felt that it was compromised. And maybe that was just my youthful kind of idealism. But I saw people who really wanted to do dialogue. Because I guess youthful idealism, which I still have actually, but wanting to make the world a better place. Um, but I struggled to see how working in dialogue, doing corporate facilitation and stuff for me at that time would allow me to fulfill that kind of mission. So I made a choice to separate like the way that I earn money from kind of my interest and passion in dialogue. And so I just immersed myself into tech, and my field is in data. So I did like a lot of data warehousing. And then eventually I kind of moved into working for tech companies out of kind of corporate um, companies. And that was a really nice change because it was a lot more casual and it's a different kind of organizational culture in startups and tech companies, which is more open and inviting, basically. Uh, and then, so at this point, probably like late 20s, early 30s, I'd say, actually, by now, working for a tech company, one of the large real estate companies in Australia called Domain. Then I moved to another company, which was a marketplace, basically. And I moved into a head of role at that time. And this is maybe 2017 or something like that we're talking. And at this point, like I'd continued to read about dialogue and whatnot, but it had really had been on the back burner for some time. But I read a book by Terry Patton, I think, The New Republic of the Soul. And he talked in it about this idea of we spaces, which I had encountered some time ago, but was kind of re-prompted by this. And I reached out to a friend, and he said he was interested in the concept too. So we organized catching up and practicing dialogue together, you know, in this kind of collective, unusual way that we spaces are. And I'll fork back to the tech company that I joined actually, because when I joined it and when I went to the meetings, what I saw was like, I guess quite typical at the time, but it was the meetings, it was about who got in the quickest in between the spaces, who kind of spoke the loudest. And the meetings weren't particularly like, I guess they had a lot of anti patterns in them for what good meetings would look like. And there was at times like not many people contributing, a few people kind of dominating and the like. And because I had like experience in facilitation and some training, I started to bring the idea of facilitation to the organization and started to introduce simple kind of patterns like speaking lists and raising your hand and whatnot. And I kind of like I rolled that out across the company and did some kind of company-wide presentations. And that was, I guess, the beginning of starting to bring my interest in dialogue kind of into my workplace. I was the head of data at that role. And at the time I was also part of a engineering management group. And we had a great manager, but it was also like it was probably as close to dialogue as I had got in the workplace, the meetings that we were having. Um, and they started with the same kind of pattern, but they settled with some facilitation. But one of the things I noticed was the impact of speaking up and bringing tension into the room, basically, and disagreeing in the management group, which was a healthy thing to do, right? Like but I think what I noticed is by doing that, it encouraged other people to do that. And I really witnessed like a deepening of psychological safety and a real building sense of connection, that this felt like a team and it felt very safe to kind of challenge and push each other and to explore stuff together. And so this kind of uh, started to draw me in more into like, okay, the like dialogue in the workplace feels like it could have a place. And then in parallel to this, I started We Spaces with a friend, and it was just a casual kind of thing, catching up. And that was around the beginning of COVID, basically. So moved all online. We ended up doing it for about 18 months, but and then I moved into like I met Ria, who runs Collective Presencing, and I started practicing with her, and that's where I met you, Amanda, and some of the others in the call. But what I started in doing the dialogue practices, I started to, I guess, I was very interested in the mechanics of what was happening, like how we could go into a space together, but feel through the process that we followed like deeply connected to each other, and like we were kind of following on a journey of unfolding together or inquiry. And I started to, because I was the head of a department, I got curious about, okay, maybe I can set up a space at work for the department where we just do something like that. And I called it a data council. And it was with the data department. And the department, like, was between like, it was 6 and 20 people over the time that I was kind of there. But what we would do is we'd go in and because for people who've done dialogue and check-in processes, like you start to just notice how they do help you calibrate your nervous systems or bring everything kind of into this settled state of openness together. So that's what we'd do in a data council. We'd just have silence, and then people would check in, and it would take, it could take half an hour, possibly a bit more. And then after everyone had checked in, maybe we'd explore a question together. And what was so, and I did this on a regular cadence, like it might have been every couple of weeks for a long time. And it's a very different meeting in the corporate world, of course, to do a meeting like that, where there's a lot of silence. If you stepped into it, it doesn't seem like there's any purpose, and there's no action items that are kind of being taken away from the meeting. But what I noticed was it started to create these like ripples and effects across the organization. And it came from, I feel like, the shared alignment that was being built in largely the meaning making that came after the check-in, where we'd talk about the role of data in the organization, how it was being used, what were some of the ways that it wasn't being used, like just the various different perspectives. And in that slow conversation, we'd all walk away like slightly more oriented in the same direction. And what I felt is that meant when all of us were out interacting across the organization, we were all kind of starting to push people in a particular direction. And like when I started that process, it was about 6 people, the data department. And I feel like as a consequence of that slow building process, data grew a lot. Like I felt my career and impact at the company was kind of like the growth of the data department, the impact it had. I largely credit those conversations basically. And what's like interesting and beautiful about that is we didn't go into a room and develop this like hardcore strategy. we're going to go out and do these like 6 things in this order, and it's going to like create this kind of impact. That was very reflective of my experiences in dialogue, which is you don't know what actually happens till it happens in a way. And I felt only when I looked back at the impact that we'd made in the organization that it seemed that you could see the impact basically. So I left that company, and then I joined another company. And this time I joined as the head of engineering, and it was a data company. But the CEO of that company, in a way, like he invited me in and said, I don't know how to do this. I'm how to run a tech company. He's younger than me. But it was growing quite well. And he gave me a lot of space and trust to kind of like go ahead and run things the way that I thought. And having had quite a positive experience at the last company, um, running things in that way, I ran it very similarly. So I ran like a all hands engineering meeting, and I did that initially like on a high cadence of probably once a week because there was a lot of change when I joined, and I'd started to appreciate the dynamics of how teams form. But I feel like the first experience I had when I was the head of data at that tech company was like kind of getting familiar with it. But when I reapplied it again at the next company, it was having done it once before. I felt I was able to go deeper with it. And I left that company after about 14 months. But when I left, I felt like I understood it. Felt I understood how it was working in the organizations, and I felt I had a lot more language for what was happening compared to when I kind of first kicked it off. So, um,
Mm. Yeah, I'm curious. Can you hear me? Yeah.
yeah.
Um, when you started practicing collective presencing more regularly, you already had then an experience of dialogue. You already had an understanding somehow. I'm curious how the regular practice with Ria changed your understanding of dialogue and how it shifted you or how it changed you. Yeah, I'm asking because in my experience, it has changed me. The practice doing regularly has changed me. I'm curious if you have that sense as well, and how did you see that change?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The question, I noticed like a rush of warmth runs through my body then actually prompted by that because yeah, it has been really powerful, and it started before Ria actually. Like when I was doing just uh, a friend and his friend, there was really like three of us. Um, we'd been doing it for I don't know 3 4 months, and I ran into one of my friends on the train, and we started talking about it, and he kind of asked, had I noticed that it had been changing the way that I relate to the world or something like that, and like we both kind of reflected that we felt like it was changing us in some way. I can't quite put my words on it, but like I guess you call it. It's because there's a fair bit of presence. It's a slow, reflective practice. Obviously, it's almost like a meditation. So I think it was bringing a lot of like self awareness, and it was also helping me feel a lot more attuned to my body as well, and the noticing of the way my body was feeling. that particular group that we were doing, it was really just catching up and exploring. It was very explorative, and we reached some very interesting states of consciousness, I'd say. Like at times it was quite psychedelic, but it was also quite ungrounded, in the sense that we felt that we could float out in deep space together, but we weren't really sure what to do with that. And I think I heard of Ria and I reached out to her, and she actually joined one of our. We invited her to come to one of the dialogue sessions that we had, and she dropped in and she kind of um, she was like, "What's the inquiry? What's the question here?" And I think we she might have put one in the space or something like that. But I felt how the inquiry gave it a trajectory. So rather than just kind of like floating around, it kind of gave it movement in a particular direction. So I liked that. I liked Ria, and I was curious. So then I started attending sessions with Ria as well. And Ria's obviously thought a lot about this. And what I got from her is like obviously her Ria's written a book called Collective Presencing, and I read a lot of that book. And she talks about like the structure of dialogue, the circle of presence and the circle of creation. And she introduces like the norms, kind of the things that she'd noticed that were kind of supporting the experience: silence, not yet knowing space, talking to the middle, listening to the middle, stuff like that. So the regular practice then, which I did for multiple years with Ria, felt like going to the dojo or something like that, like the karate training place, to practice the discipline of the skill, I guess, or the modality of that particular type of dialogue. And it is in that practice that I could witness and pay attention and understand more deeply, doing it over and over again, like what was happening in the space and why it was happening. And yeah, at the same time, like it was just also a transformative experience for me from an internal place as well, because I don't know, made me a lot more aware, I think, particularly of social dynamics. When you sit in, having sat in a lot of the dialogue spaces, really just like putting our attention intensely onto the minor kind of fluctuations of social communication in those quiet spaces. It meant going into other spaces. I felt like in the workplace, I could suddenly pick up a lot more of the feel and the energy and whatnot that was happening. So I think that made me more receptive and capable of influencing and navigating and kind of, I don't know, holding those spaces in a workplace.
Yeah. Ria calls it the subtle sensing, right? To to sense what is subtle. And yeah, I felt like I have developed some antennas um after after years of practice. Um so then I'm curious, how did you face any resistance when introducing dialogue in your teams?
No, no real direct resistance. I think, if anything, the resistance came from my inability to articulate it
Mm.
in a language which was um, able to be understood. Like, I guess, being somewhat of a deep practitioner of dialogue. Like it's easy for me to be like far too technical and far too off the deep end. And it comes across as being obtuse to other people, perhaps. But I felt in the environments that I was working, people were very open to it. Um, the resistance, actually, there was some resistance. I mean, not not enormously. Like you're surprised actually. Like you might think that sitting a bunch of engineers around and asking them to talk about their feelings and be a bit vulnerable would be not a recipe for success, but I think people really appreciated it because it's, the capitalist world can be a bit cold and disconnected, and the opportunity to do something different is, yeah, which is a bit more heart centered, I think was warmly received. At some point, the engineering department was becoming quite large, and the check ins were taking the course of the full hour, basically. And I thought that it might be a good idea to just have one person from each space, from each area, talk from each team. And my thinking there was that if you take a step back to like, why is a check in useful in an organization? And like, what is the mechanics of it? So the way that I think about, I guess, to go into like the theory that I have around like intelligent organizations or organisms, it's essentially about like high signal flow. Like it, so like a metaphor here might be like a beehive or something like that. And they're called superorganisms. And what's happening in a beehive is there's just so much information that's going through the hive all the time. They're communicating, they're listening to each other, and they're responsive. Um, and an interesting thing about beehives is when you smoke them, like when the beekeepers go to take the honey, what they're really doing is they're just disrupting the communication flow because the smoke kind of washes out some of the pheromones that they use to communicate. So the organism becomes dumb and it can't generate an intelligent response. And so within an organization, the more present, aware, and the more kind of communication and signal that's flowing through the organization, the more it can kind of be adaptive and responsive. So through the context of a check-in, like people say, it's great to bring your full self to work. Well, the reason I understand that to be good is because it gives people more information that they can use to communicate with you. So when you sit in a check-in and you talk about the things that are happening or present for you right now, it gives other people signal that they can use to better relate and calibrate with you. So in the context of an organization, a check-in is an opportunity to just generate signal from across the organization. So the organization can calibrate itself and kind of align. So I reached out to a few different people in each of the teams. I said, hey, in this check-in, can you speak? And I got a lot of feedback from people that they felt disappointed that they wouldn't get an opportunity to share, and like they just felt it wasn't appropriate to kind of do that. And I thought that was super interesting because clearly people had valued it. Yeah.
Wow. And they would bring their personal check-ins, like talking about their how they were feeling and
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. There is like some other feedback I did receive at one point, and I think it speaks to the power dynamics that can show up in the spaces. because a lot of the, like, to be able to bring the right energy into the space and have people check in authentically and stuff like that, it was quite important for me to set the tone and check in with vulnerability and honesty about what's going on for me, even if I was feeling uncomfortable or anxious about work and things like that. So I would seek to kind of like create a sense of we are all peers, but I still have, I recognize like quite a commanding presence, and the energy that I brought into the space was a large part of creating like the kind of field or the energy in the room. Um, and I think for people who are very early in their career or um, maybe not necessarily, or maybe just more shy or more intimidated, like a really open space where you're being asked to share with a little bit of vulnerability what's going on for you can be intimidating for people. And it can, so I got some feedback that, and I'm not sure if I agree with it, but just to kind of share it for people to reflect on that, it might be good to mix it up with some more structured activities for checking in, the kind of ones where you don't need to check in with vulnerability, but you can just write down like, you know, um, what's working, what isn't working, you know, what we should change, kind of retro structures, because they give people a different like a different opportunity or alternative way to kind of feed into the conversation, I guess, to create the signal for everyone else to calibrate on. But, yeah, just to circle back to the question, the I think the resistance came from people just not being able to make sense of it. But I introduced check-ins into most of the spaces that I went into, including the executive teams and the like. And I think everyone appreciated that those moments of spaciousness.
Mm. Yeah, from what I've been talking with people, not everyone wants to see the working space as as necessarily a belonging space or a place where they need to form friendships, or not everyone have that need. Yeah, the need to, yeah. So how, I'm curious, how do you see this in when it comes to work and organizations, and how people find their sense of belonging and how they attached to their occupation and
Yeah, I think like I'm not necessarily looking for friendships at work. And I don't think that the dialogue practices, like they create a sense of belonging and connection, but it doesn't have to be. I think maybe the experience that I would use here is I have felt in the dialogue spaces that I've done through Zoom, through collective presencing, like a deeper sense of connection than I have to my friends. And that is without really knowing the names, the backstory, or having any kind of sense of what you'd consider traditional relationship with the people in the space. So that sense of belonging can be crafted without it needing to be personal in some way. It's, I don't know, there's feels like there's some kind of paradox. here. Because I certainly wasn't going into these spaces with this like, hey, we're a family. Let's like it's not group therapy, I guess. Like the lens that I would bring to it is we're we're doing it for a purpose. Like we're checking in because it helps us work better together. And that, yeah. So I think what doesn't make much sense to me is to go into an organization and not want to work better with people, basically. Like that, like if I would be challenging an individual who worked for me or worked with me, if that was where they kind of came from. Because I think we do our best work when we do show up in all the ways that we need to show up in that moment. Because it comes back to that there's more signal being generated, there's more layers of communication that we've got to work with. And signal feels really important for good quality decision making, basically. Yeah, so I think like we're in this hybrid workspace now, and I definitely am very much a camera on person. And even when people are in the office, if it's a hybrid meeting with some at home, like I'm encouraging, in fact, I'm asking people to open their laptops, turn their cameras on, even if they're sitting in a meeting room, just to create that, just so we've got as much kind of information in front of us as we can for connection. Mm.
Mm. Are you done? Sorry.
I'm done. Yeah.
Um, yeah, you spoke about decision making. How did the dialogue impact the decision making inside the executive team you were working with?
So the executive teams are typically full of, um, you know, if you take a meeting, the ones that I kind of referred to in the beginning, where the meeting's dominated by a few voices and it's about who kind of gets in the space and those kind of dynamics. An executive team is typically full of all of those louder people. So you've got a room full of people who all want to have their say and are good at kind of getting into the spaces and stuff like that. I Beyond the check-in, like once the meeting started, and this kind of it starts to get to the tension and the topic, right? Which is like you can have slow dialogue spaces, but you need to make decisions and you need to turn it into action as well. And that was always like the really interesting thing that I'd say, like I'm still working out, basically, because if you're having an executive meeting, you can't um, like decisions need to be made. You need to go through things. You need to. There's a balance between the methodical and the kind of reflective. So we experimented with different kind of meeting structures in the executive team. The concept or the idea that I had was we'd try and insert some space for some kind of reflective conversation. We'd have a bit of a check-in. There'd be an agenda of going through metrics and the things that needed to be talked about, but then we'd try and kind of make space for a reflective conversation. But I wouldn't say that we had a lot of success in making the space or finding the the right kind of energy or something like that. It's really interesting though, because when you go on an offsite, with a team or something like that, what happens is there is space, and often, if it's facilitated, people will do some activities to bring them into vulnerability so people feel closer, and everyone walks away from the offsite feeling like super aligned. But because I've been on quite a few offsites and I've just seen the pattern, like within a couple of weeks, it feels like that's completely lost and everything's just back to kind of the typical way that it happened. So um, I think that's because there was a lack of a consistent cadence of reflective spaces. An offsite was like an outlier, basically, but then it came back into the normal kind of grind in a way. So that was kind of my experience at the tech company where I was the head of data, but as the head of engineering working with this this other startup. Um, I had a closer relationship with the CEO, and we were very different. He was very um, go-getter, high energy, very passionate, stuff like that. I'm much more kind of quieter and slower and kind of grounded, I'd say. I can't. I had a lot of influence over the company, but in the executive spaces, like, yeah, I can't. I don't know. I mean, I have a reflection on it. I guess it goes to the maturity, right? The emotional maturity of people in the room to some degree. Emotional, psychological, I don't know, developmental level stuff. Um, just reflecting on what I want to say here, but I look, I think I'd just say I would love and kind of yearn for an experience of working with uh, other leaders from that place. I think it would be really powerful. But I think I found myself to be the outlier in those groups. And the role that I played largely was one of, because I felt comfortable with tension and disagreement, the role that I played in both the executive teams that I've been part of is one of um, being someone who disagrees because I don't agree with the kind of direction that things are going. And that my ability to do that was influenced by dialogue, I would say. And I think it had a positive influence on the conversations because I could say the things that other people felt but maybe weren't comfortable to say in the spaces. But it wasn't, yeah, I wouldn't call it particularly dialogic.
Mm, yeah. I'm noticing, I'm curious about what the group is thinking. And if people would have questions to ask, now would be the moment.
Can I go ahead and ask? Yeah. Hi. Um, I'm curious about. It seems like um, you brought a dialogue practice to like the like wider engineering team, and then also like check-ins as a vibe to the executive group. Um, and with the engineering team, how often did you do those? Were they kind of just did they have like any sort of goal beyond just kind of touching in with people and having them be able to feel heard.
So when I joined that organization, they had an engineering team of about 10 people. And there was a fair bit of, I would have done them once a week, I think, in the beginning. And it was because I wanted to, I guess my understanding of how teams are built is very much kind of modeled on dialogue in a way. Like you want a group of people to fall into attunement where they're kind of really looking at each other and being like, hey, we're a team, let's do this together. And to create that, you need that vulnerability, you need the nervous systems kind of like dropping in together and practicing that on a regular basis. So I wanted to start to create that. So I ran them weekly, but it was also important because I wanted us to make meaning about what we were doing. Basically, like, what are we doing in this company? Basically, like really build alignment around purpose in the engineering team, and really draw that out. So that initial work takes regular conversations. So the way I think about it is when you're forming a team, you want to do that more often because you're building alignment. But as you find alignment and trust and that sense of attunement with others, you can slow the cadence down. So I think I might have dropped it to fortnightly at some stage. And then ultimately, the engineering team grew too big to have conversations in it. Like we could more or less spend a whole hour doing check-ins. And when it got to that stage, I had to kind of reimagine it a little bit because at this stage, there wasn't a lot of opportunity for meaning making about things in the organization. And I did consider at times whether I should remove the meeting, but I kind of stuck to my guns in a way. And the reason that I did that was because I felt I think I believe to be in a team with other people, like a high performing team, you need to come together and you need to feel together is maybe the way that like if you're not feeling together, and I mean emotionally feeling, then you're not part of the same body in a way. And so the experience of coming together, even at this point, we were once a month, was largely it was to listen. So it was to practice some of the skills, because I saw that also as skill practicing in communication. Talk with vulnerability, practice listening. But the wider kind of purpose for me was a few. One was like signal generation across the organization, which was useful because it helped everyone, even if we weren't being explicit with the meaning making, they could make up their own meaning as they listened to the other way that other people were feeling. And it was personal and work check-ins. So it wasn't like work wasn't out of it. It was like check in personally. And if there's anything you want to reflect on with work, kind of do that too. So it was generating signal for that. But I think also importantly, like I felt it was important as an engineering team that we came together and as we listened, we felt the emotions that other people shared. Because people would sometimes share big emotions and sad emotions and happy emotions and stuff like that. And that was all useful and valuable to create that sense of attunement in a team. Yeah. When I left, though, there was like a bit of a like a fork, and one group of people came out and they said they didn't like the meeting. They felt like it was a big waste of time. They needed to get to work and focus. And a bunch of other people were like still keen to continue it kind of running. I'm not sure where it's at today, but yeah. it's a very subtle meeting in terms of impact. So I can definitely appreciate how people could look at it. And especially we had a lot of new people join the organization. And at this point, I was already on my way out. So they weren't kind of, in a way, like indoctrinated into the energy of it, which I was able to carry with a degree of clarity better than perhaps some of the other leaders that I'd been passing the baton to.
Yeah, I feel like it can be kind of subversive to even have a space like this where it's not about like a direct productive um, impact, but it's more like a cultural thing. Yeah. Thank you.
Uh, Amanda, if I could share a little bit about the take on the action side of things,
Yes,
because we've
please.
spoken a fair bit about the dialogue part, actually.
Yes, please.
Is that okay? Yeah, cool. So, look, I think the main point that I want to make here is I realized that the generative effect of dialogue actually the same principles applied in the way of working with other people. Basically, it's just that rather than being in a room or a meeting, so the experience in a room or a meeting is there's a sense of like settling in together. And then once people are settled, the group goes on a journey together with their attention on something kind of and just seeing what unfolds. And in the act of making things with other people, like I found more or less all of the same principles applied, but it didn't happen in a room. It happened from interaction to interaction over time, over days and weeks and months. So, like a conversation there and a conversation there and a conversation there, but the principles of um, like not knowing yet and being able to move forward with having like vision and purpose and hopefully even strategy and a plan, but not being like ultra wedded to it felt really important. Um, there's this, I think that might be at the heart of it because there's a lot of business is all about, it's very linear, a lot of the frameworks. We're going to do planning sessions once a quarter. We're going to come up with OKRs or goals and we're going to pursue them. I really shied away from that and I saw that as being quite effective because we'd be making space for some reflective conversation, but we'd go out into the world, into the workplace, and we'd do the things, but we'd be coming back together on a regular basis to kind of reflect on how it was going and kind of adjust with that kind of principle of not knowing yet, of being open, of kind of listening to because in the dialogue space, like we're speaking, but we're also listening to the signal that's being generated from other people. And similar when we're making something with other people in a workplace, there's a lot of signal that's being generated from other people. And we want to try and attend to that. And the signal might just be you had a great idea and you went and spoke to someone and they kind of shut it down. And, you know, but all of it's kind of meaningful in a way. So one of the practices that I had with the CEO that I worked with is we'd catch up and we'd talk about things, but we'd frame it in terms of sharing signal. Like, hey, just wanted to share some signal. I noticed, such and such was saying this about this thing, or, I had an idea about this thing, and what we were doing was kind of like putting it in the middle in a way. It wasn't a thread to be closed in the conversation or anything like that. It was this sense of collaborating with other people in a way of putting signal in the middle, not resolving it right then and there, and just seeing what happened over time with the signal and with the actions. And so that sense of aligning with other people became a process that happened over time, and it was really supported by the principles or the practices that I had been learning and practicing in the dialogue spaces. And that, yeah, it was really quite successful, basically. Like I saw it worked, and I definitely walked away. So I feel very confident with the approach, I guess, um, of doing things in this particular way.
Mm. Can you give us an example of something that you were building and just a concrete example?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, on a technical level, the kind of things that the company would build would be like data engineering pipelines and data ingestion systems and stuff like that. But um, maybe like on an organizational level, we were also building things because part of my role as the head of engineering was to like build the organization. So just to kind of give you an example of like, and really you just look at it and say like that's a collaborative process. But one of the things I'm interested in is organizational design, which is for me the way I think about that is what are the teams and how are the teams communicating and uh, making space for reflection and coordinating across the organization. So, an organizational operating system for me is kind of like a group of teams with a cadence of meetings that have very clear purpose. So, for example, like um, all of engineering catch up once a month to share signal and feel together. But we catch up every 2 weeks to look at the status of projects and products and stuff like that. One of the big challenges I had, at least like part of the work that I did at that company was when I joined, there was just one kind of like glob of a team. It was an engineering team and it had 10 people. And I had to like I believe that's not really the right way to organize things because people don't know what their role is. They don't know what they're there for. They can't, engineering is doing a whole bunch of things. It's hard to create that sense of looking at other people and saying, hey, we're doing this together. So in particular, I wanted to build an organizational design that worked. And the conversations for what that would look like would start in these kind of engineering all hands. Like I would just share the way that I was thinking about it and invite other people to kind of like dialogue with me about that. And that would, like, I wasn't rushing into doing it. It would be like I'd having a series of conversations because we were meeting every week. And just over the course of those meetings, the way that we were thinking about it was refined. And I would catch up and have one-on-ones with people. In that meeting, we would jam on stuff together around different ways to think about it. And eventually it started to like coalesce because like it made sense that there were two different teams and what the purpose would be and who was kind of falling into each of those teams. And then at that point, it's kind of like putting it on a document and just kind of like saying that's we're there and that's what we're going to do to go ahead. But the way that it came together was this slow kind of coalescing of concepts. Um, and that felt like a very dialogic way to kind of to arrive at organizational design. Does that help from a concrete perspective?
Yeah, yes, it does. It's hard for me to um understand fully because I don't know what was the final product of that company.
I see. The final product, to be really clear, there was like we had a in the beginning there was an engineering team and it was a data science startup. So what we started to do is we separated it into three teams actually. There was a team which was a customer engineering team, which helped the customers like integrate the system. Then there was another team which we called core model, which was a team which was focused on the data science aspects of the product. And then there was another team which was called it was called it was a data management tool. And it was really useful to construct those teams because it allowed the individuals who had very similar purpose to come together and say, right, we're doing something together. How are we going to go about doing that? And work quite closely together, as opposed to think of like one of the common practices in tech is this idea of a stand-up. And if you think of a stand-up, it's everyone coming together and saying what they're doing with their day. And if you've got people doing such a variety of things that are disconnected from each other and they don't really understand the relationships, what happens is the relationship between the different things, it's very easy for it to become a meaningless meeting because nobody's really listening to each other. They don't feel like a team, basically, because they're not working on the same thing. So organizational design was, we're going to have these teams, they've got this purpose, they've got these people in them, and these teams are going to catch up with each other on this particular cadence of meetings. They're going to have their own kind of design and planning meetings on this cadence. Gives people a structure to work in, basically.
Thank you, Dan. Glenna has a question. Glenna, do you want to unmute or do you want to?
There you go. I'm unmuted, Amanda. And yeah, I'm not going to put on my video because I have a very weak signal where I am. As you were speaking about signals, listening to signals, one of the things I was curious about is, I think we often, when we talk about reimagining work or the future of work, we often speak about what dialogue could bring or what collective presencing could bring. And it's kind of like, here's what I think would be good for work and the evolution of work. And as you've been listening if you could kind of step back and look at kind of your history, which, the pathway, the rivers that you were on, and your exploration around dialogue and around collective and the practices, I'm curious what the signals are saying to you if you imagined the question of what is work as a collective being calling forth and calling for us to bring into the co-creation or co-imagining of work evolving and moving forward. If that makes any sense to you, I'd love to hear what you've been learning and hearing, sensing. That's it.
So what's coming up for me as I listen to your question, just reflected there is I believe that there's a much deeper level of relationship that we can have in working with other people. And as I kind of qualified earlier, I don't mean like friendships or anything like that. I think I often think about this, or the way that I phrase it for myself is the experience of creating with other people, basically. Like for me, that is what is at the essence of, I guess, what we'd call work. What are we making together? What are we creating together? And when we're coming from a place of like this open, attuned awareness and alignment and stuff like that, I feel, I think we'll be able to make some amazing things together, in essence. There's another thread that runs through me, and I'm quite idealistic. So, I'm not sure this is going to be happening anytime soon, but I do, like, I guess I wonder about the transactional nature of society and capitalism and all of that. Um, yeah, because I'm not sure that the best, like, not sure we realize the fullest potential when everything is transactional, basically. So I'm not quite sure what I mean by that, but at the moment I'm experimenting in a few different ways, basically, because having been part of like VC-backed high growth tech firms, I currently don't have a lot of desire to participate in that at this point in time, because I felt that ultimately what is intelligence really? For me, it comes back to the ability to like make wise decisions in response to the environment and the context that we find ourselves in. And what I have honestly been disappointed in, I think, is like the quality of decision making that happens within organizations. And it happens for a variety of different reasons. None of it is like intentional. But I think for me, the mechanics of it starts to fall apart because the signal that is important is being washed out by the noise, basically. The noise might be ego, or it might be fear, or it might be pressures from different places and the like. So one of the experiments I'm working on at the moment is an experiment in, I think I have a belief, like obviously the current status quo works quite well economically. Like a lot of the big tech companies, Amazon and Facebook and the like, they're not led in dialogic ways. They're largely founder led and the founders must be exceptional people who have very good judgment. So that method really works. But I think I have a belief that there is a future of work, there's a future type of organization that I don't think we've managed to bring into being in too many places. I haven't experienced it myself, that operates with more kind of attunement and presence. And I think my hypothesis is that will lead to better decision making, which will lead to more successful, impactful organizations. So ultimately, I think if we get this right, like these types of organizations could be bigger and stronger and more powerful and more purposeful than the organizations that exist today. Yeah, and I'm quite interested in kind of making that, or at least continuing to experiment with that.